Hello, everyone, and welcome to Government 340's Central Asian Politics. Today, we're going to be discussing society, so looking at developments in rural and urban livelihoods and politics in post-Soviet space, along with trends of migration that we see in Central Asia, and more specifically, migration out of Central Asia. So first, we're going to look at some empirics. So this first chart is looking at Soviet urban rural population percentages. So we can see from looking at this, it's from the years 1926 to 1989, and we see what the major trend is a major population growth occurring in Central Asia, especially between the years of 1959 and 1979. During this time, we also see the share of the urban population. So this is shown with the line in green, that the urban population is growing and reaches 46% at the time of Soviet collapse. So what we can tell from this is that there is population growth, firstly, and secondly, that there is a trend towards urbanization in Soviet Central Asia. We can, however, see that despite the fact that the urban population has grown over this time from 13 to 46%, the majority of the population shown by the part of the graph in orange is still rural. Looking at post-Soviet urban-rural populations, we see kind of a contradictory trend. So rather than the urban population going up, we see the urban population between 1990 and 2010 actually falling over time. But we can see that this is not because of a drop in the actual numbers of the urban population. So if we look at the portion of this graph in blue, the population that's living in urban areas is relatively constant, and it might even go up a bit between 2005 and 2010. We see the percentage of the urban population drop from 46% in 1989 to 40.7% in 2010, largely because the rural population over this time has grown. This is interesting because a lot of the readings that we focused on for this lecture were focused on this idea of rural flight, so the depopulation of rural zones. But if we look at this chart, we actually see that the rural population has been growing at least a little bit over this time. And this might be because there's higher birth rates among the rural population than the urban population, or that we're looking at a chart that is considering most migrant labor to be seasonal rather than permanent in nature. A lot of migrant labor might be of a seasonal nature, so when you're looking at census data, it will still be recorded as part of the population in these rural areas, even though their main source of employment stems from working outside the country. So what this might be picking up is the lack of ability to consistently measure rural populations because of the nature of migrant labor. Another interesting feature that we see from this growth of the rural population and a lack of growth of the urban population can indicate to us that there has been a lack of urbanization, or at the very least, there's a lack of prospects in urban areas. So this depopulation of rural zones that we might be seeing through urbanization or labor migration outside of the Central Asian states is not really reflected in these numbers. But it's also important to remember that this is looking at Central Asia as an aggregate rather than individual states. And we have seen variations across Central Asia in their degree of labor migration. So you see far more coming from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan than you do from Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan, for instance. And that's really because there's more work opportunities and greater resource wealth in those two states than you see in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Additionally, one thing that we can look at is the sectors in Central Asia. So looking at these charts, they outline what percentage of the economy is devoted to various types of sectors. So in green, we have agriculture, in orange, industry, and in blue, services. And we can see by looking at this that besides Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, the largest sector is agriculture in Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. You do see these states having relatively large service industries as well. Kazakhstan is notable in having 45.2% of its economy being from services rather than from agriculture or industry. But when we do look across these numbers, besides Kazakhstan, they have relatively low percentages of their economies devoted to industry. Interestingly, we also see the industry sector being relatively small in Turkmenistan. So of these states, it is the second smallest, only ahead of Tajikistan. And this is despite it having oil and gas resources that make it arguably more similar to Kazakhstan, but it doesn't seem like it's being operationalized according to these numbers. From these empirics, we're going to first discuss rural life in Central Asia before moving on to a comparison between this and urban life, before discussing the specific urban-rural divides that we see in Central Asia. So rural life is often idealized by individuals in Central Asia. It's viewed as a traditional means of living with a long history, and it is highly romanticized. It is seen as a means to link with the past and a traditional way of life that has been practiced in Central Asia for centuries. And although the Soviet Union changed a lot of these practices, the underlying practice of farming, of pastoralism, of raising animals, of harvest, these have kept going. And in a region that has experienced a wide degree of power fluctuations, those kinds of constants become kind of national signifiers. But contrastingly, you also see rural life being looked down upon as backward or unmodern. So they value ruralism as a particular way of life of kind of this historical romantic ideal. But they don't necessarily value the individuals who live that life in the modern era. So there's kind of this focus on urbanization, on industrialization, even in the post-Soviet era, that favors these city environments vis-a-vis the rural life that is viewed as the traditional means of living. And this very much echoes the Soviet propaganda about rural life, in that it is a backward way of living. And the Soviets applied urbanization and industrialization even to agriculture during the Soviet era, and attempted to standardize these practices and institute a type of industrial farming. And when we look at this, the Soviets were able to create these very large-scale farms. And there was a degree of standardization through their collectivization model, but the forced settlization of large portions of the population and the massive expansion of farming went well beyond the actual carrying capacity of the farmland in Central Asia. So the treatment of kind of this one-size-fits-all standardized farming practice contributed to additional water shortages and other ecological disasters that continued to devastate Central Asia to this day. The drainage of the Aral Sea is one that receives a lot of international attention, but there are other problems as well, such as the stripping of the topsoil in a lot of countries, particularly Uzbekistan, with its cotton farms, the depletion of soil nutrients, the overuse of pasture lands, and the instability and unsustainability of sedentary pastoralism have all impacted rural life in both Soviet Central Asia and post-Soviet Central Asia. And it's also important to remember that we see different types of rural life in Central Asia. So although all are idealized, you see different states idealizing different types of rural life. So the sedentary populations were primarily concentrated in the southern part of Central Asia. These areas were densely populated, more socially conservative than the pastoral nomadic groups to the north, and they are the descendants of Turco-Iranian groups. They were also the first to convert to Islam. So looking back at our lectures from last week, we saw that the southern reaches of Central Asia were the first to adopt Islam and follow more traditional Islamic practices than kind of the more traditional versions of nature worship that are unique to Central Asia pre-Islam. And in this region, water is really the crucial resource. So water entitlements are even more important than land rights in a lot of cases. And historically, due to complex irrigation networks, you saw very high degrees of cooperation between individuals and villages. Conversely, we see pastoral nomadic groups primarily concentrated in the north of Central Asia and along the reaches of the Eurasian steppe. These groups are the descendants of Turco-Mongolic groups rather than Turco-Iranian ones. And this is part of the reason why you see the difference in language groups. So in Tajikistan, you see them speaking a variant of Persian, and that region has traditionally been sedentary, so the descendants of Turco-Iranian groups, whereas the northern regions are descendants primarily of Turco-Mongolic groups and therefore speak Turkic languages predominantly. You saw more scattered populations in the north with low population densities, causing a reliance on tribal and clan organization rather than these more complex networks that you see in the south, and kind of a lack of an organizational structure like that brought by these irrigation networks that you see among the sedentary farming populations. You also see a different specialization in goods. So the sedentary population was primarily concentrated on farming, whereas the pastoral nomadic ones were predominantly herders. This is also why the Soviet collectivization process was much more traumatic in areas of northern Central Asia. So these nomadic groups were forced to sedentarize during this process. So you had their way of life and their means of income both stripped, and kind of a forcing of these groups to start farming on land that had not traditionally been used for such purposes, which contributed to the famines that we saw in Kazakhstan during the initial phase of collective farming. Well, it's not the sole reason why we saw famines there, but it is a reason why it was as bad as it was. We also see a variety of post-Soviet vulnerabilities that are not necessarily directly due to the Soviet rule. So in this, we see that there is a lack of access to basic necessities in a lot of rural areas. This is access to water, electricity, schools, hospital, infrastructure such as roads, and the like. These aspects and the provision of these basic necessities is starting to improve in a lot of rural areas in Central Asia, as they have recovered from the post-Soviet economic collapse. You see the state being better able to provide these. But at least initially after the Soviet collapse, there was a lot of difficulty in providing these goods. And still to this day, there is some difficulty in providing them. We also see agricultural production still lag far behind the international competitors, and this puts farming at a disadvantage in Central Asia, and this is a problem that they have not necessarily been able to solve and will not be an easy one to solve, in that these goods are primarily being produced for domestic consumption because the goods are not competitive on the international markets. And really, this most harshly impacts small producers. So big farms are able to weather a lot of these difficulties in access to basic necessities, in access to wealth, in access to markets. But you see small producers being the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged in the present system. Looking at urban life, we also see a very large impact of the Soviet period. So the Soviet Union was very interested in urban planning. So the construction of an orderly urban lifestyle was something that they were very focused on providing. So this included available mass transit systems that could reach the majority of their urban populations, instituting a grid-like structure to cities, so organized roadways, and they also limited the population of these cities. And so mass transit and employment and housing constraints really caused the Soviet Union to only focus on providing for a small urban population. So you had to get certain permits if you wanted to live in cities. And by restricting the population, you saw them able to provide more for the individuals who did live in these cities. But in the post-Soviet era, we've seen those restrictions on the number of individuals living in cities being lifted. So the expansion of the population in these urban zones has led to increased strain on a lot of the various services that were provided in the Soviet era. So there's been a lack of adequate housing, a lack of employment opportunities, and the mass transit systems that the Soviets established have not been able to really keep up with the increased population and increased usership. Additionally, while the Soviets valued mass transit, you don't see a similar valuation of these transport systems in modern Central Asia. So a lot of individuals want cars and are more individualistic, so the benefits provided by mass transit are less valued by the citizenry, and people have more ready access to cars. So in the USSR, your ability to get a car was severely restricted, and there was up to a 10-year wait in some cases for actually getting a car. But the mass transit system now is decaying and unreliable, and it does not reach all of the population, especially in these newer settlements and apartment buildings that have gone up on the edges of cities. There's a lack of adequate metro lines, and you really need to have a car to get to locations. Additionally, there is they have started to refer to the tram lines as suicide lane lines because the schedule is not fully mapped out. So you have a tendency to have trams run in both directions on the tram lines, meaning that they could crash into one another. It's also not particularly safe for bike or pedestrian traffic. But much like the Soviet era, you do see a very intense interest in continuing urban planning. And you've seen much more instances of projects for urban areas in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan because these two states had more money with which to devote to these processes, as opposed to Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, the money is primarily coming from resource wealth. And so they had more money to put into building new monuments and destroying or removing the Soviet monuments and remaking buildings with a new style. Now, they did keep some monuments from the Soviet era, particularly those devoted to World War II remembrance and those devoted to a friendship of peoples. And Kazakhstan was careful to keep a lot of those friendship of peoples monuments that were put up by the Soviet era, kind of keeping the ethnic inclusiveness that had characterized Soviet-era propaganda with regards to ethnicity and nationalism. You also see a lot of these populations still very keen to remember and honor those who had fought in World War II. So the memory of World War II still is very, very strong in Central Asia and the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan probably made the most extreme move to break with the Soviet era in that Kazakh officials actually moved the capital from Almaty to Astana. And they've started to refer to Astana as the heart of Eurasia, and they're using the reconstruction of the city as a source of national pride and pride in the homeland. Turkmenistan has been more focused on the standardization of its building structure, and it's been very restrictive to pedestrian space. But the main goal of the Turkmen government has been to create imposing facades in the capital of Ashgabat. And throughout Central Asia, we've seen the building of new monuments to local heroes and figures, replacing the Soviet ones. And this really feeds into the creation of national mythos and foundational myths, in that they are creating their national culture and creating visible signs that is their culture, and an appreciation for what had been, in their view, suppressed during the Soviet era. In addition to kind of this decaying mass transit system and the urban planning, we also see consumerism being a huge component of the post-Soviet urban life. And this really exacerbates wealth disparities, in that it makes those disparities highly visible. And many cannot afford to live in cities at this point. So there's really been a high increase in the construction of slums on the outskirts of cities. And according to most elites, this ruins the image of the city. So the former president of Kazakhstan, President Nazarbayev, has repeatedly ordered for many of these sites to be bulldozed. And they don't provide alternative housing for the individuals who are live there. They're either forced to leave or to reconstruct said slums. And many of these slums lack access to even the very basic necessities. Additionally, you really only see the infrastructure and state apparatus responsive to the elite and kind of their whims. So one particular story that we got from the readings focused on this rather upscale neighborhood in the outskirts of Astana. And the residents there not only had to own a car, but had to own a vehicle that was capable of off-road driving, because the roads to that neighborhood were not even paved, and they remained unpaved despite the fact that this was a higher end neighborhood, until the president of Kazakhstan, until President Nazarbayev started frequenting the tennis courts that were located there. And when he started going there, he complained about the fact that the road there was not paved and it was unpleasant to drive on. And after that, the road to this neighborhood was paved, but it took the president deciding and complaining about the lack of roads for one to be built. So we see this across Central Asia, in that the wealth inequalities continue to persist, and the provision of public goods happens on the basis of elite whims and elite desires, rather than this responding to the population itself. And just as a quick note, here we have a few pictures of the metro maps in Central Asia. So on the top we have the Tashkent metro in Uzbekistan. And so here we can see that they have 3 lines. Down on the bottom, we have the metro map for Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. And we can see that they have a few more. So they have 4 lines and 1 line that is a circular line so that it hits a good portion of the city's interior. And this kind of mimics the Moscow metro system. But still, there are large areas of the city that are not serviced, much like we see in Tashkent. And on the bottom right of the 3 maps on the left, we do see the Astana metro system, which has exactly 1 metro line. Additionally, in Tajikistan, in their capital of Dushanbe, they are planning to start construction on their metro line in 2025. And in Turkmenistan and Ashgabat, they are building a monorail line. It'll be the first monorail line in Central Asia, but presently it only serves the Olympic Village. Otherwise, the capitals of the cities in Central Asia are predominantly reliant on bus routes and these buses called marshrutkas. That tend to actually just be cars, like larger cars that can seat about 15 to 20 individuals. And on the right, the larger map that we see is the Moscow metro map. And from here, we can really appreciate the difference between the development of mass transit in Central Asia versus in Russia proper. The Moscow metro is probably one of the biggest in the world. During peak ridership, the trains run every 30 seconds in the city center. So within the Brown Line, all of the train stops within that circle run every 30 seconds. It's probably my favorite metro system in the world. I really wish I could pick it up and drop it onto DC, because we'd probably have a metro stop at George Mason University, and it would be very nice. But there is a distinct difference between the level of mass transportation that you see still present in Moscow vis-a-vis the cities in Central Asia. So there has been much less investment during the post-Soviet era in building new lines and in expanding the mass transit system left over by the Soviet Union, and there hasn't been much interest in building additional transportation lines. Whereas in Moscow, you do see that. So there's actually 2 circular lines in Moscow. So there's the dark brown one, and then there's the outer light brown line. And they were actually building that one when I was there in 2017. And there's not much pressure to add metro lines, since there is a preference for owning cars in a lot of these cities. But it does create a tension, because those of lower income are often reliant on mass transportation systems, and there is a lack of metro lines servicing large portions of these cities, and the other forms of mass transportation, be those buses, marshrutkas, tram lines, are notoriously unreliable and also very unsafe. In addition to wealth divides that we see in urban areas, we have an additional rural-urban divide. And we've hit on this a little bit, where urban mindsets are perceived as modern, whereas rural ones are seen as backwards. But this really serves to forward ideas of consumerism. So instead of being more focused on ideas of egalitarianism or collectivism, this village mindset is backward and unmodern. So the village life keeps traditions of egalitarianism, and this is part Soviet legacy, part collective cultural identification, part necessity of cooperation on large farms or in complex irrigation, or in farms that are reliant on complex irrigation systems. But there's really this role of reciprocity and a focus on the state's role in alleviating poverty. And we spoke about this earlier when we were speaking about structural adjustment. There's a move away from considering it to be the state's responsibility to alleviate poverty, both in urban environments and in rural ones. And this really has shifted the requirements placed on political elite to provide for their citizenry, even in authoritarian regimes. And because of this, we see the political elite more interested in providing private goods either to themselves or to their allies, both political and economic, rather than providing for the citizenry. So we see these wealth inequalities between individuals in urban areas and between urban and rural environments persist. And the elite have taken a role in promoting consumerism, even though the majority of the population can't participate in that very consumerism. We also see a generational gap occurring. So due to rural flight, the expansion of the urban population, and the prominence of migrant labor, there is a very distinct gap in the values between younger individuals who have no memory of the Soviet Union and older individuals who do have a memory of that time. And younger individuals tend to more readily accept these quote-unquote modern values common to urban environments, and the values of consumerism and individualism rather than egalitarianism are gaining salience among these younger populations. But still, the state has made few moves to overcome poverty or wealth inequality. So we're really seeing a mismatch between the material desires of the population, both young and old, and the actual lived material conditions that they have. And it doesn't seem likely that there will be huge changes in this mismatch between desires and conditions in a lot of Central Asian states in the short term. And in part due to the rampant inequality that we see in Central Asia, we do see a large degree of migratory labor. So the population is not necessarily complacent with the wealth inequalities and the lack of economic opportunities in Central Asia. And because of this, they leave predominantly to Russia. Here they face an astounding amount of racism. So a Kyrgyz doctor working in Moscow, in our readings, she states that she disguises herself as a Russian of Korean descent to be able to work. So we have here layered racism in that Koreans are discriminated against less or considered capable of holding higher and more complex jobs than those of Central Asian descent. And so she's changed her name. She uses a skin whitening cream all to do her job and to be seen as a legitimate doctor to her clients. And we see a highly segmented and stratified labor market. So market sectors sometimes exclusively hire migrant labor. And these are theoretically jobs that Russians do not want. So they're very labor intensive. They have to work long hours. And the individuals who take these jobs are typically willing to work for less pay. And this serves to suppress real wages in Russia, and also specifically among the migrant community. And because Russians don't want to work these jobs, they're seen as lesser and are given less pay. And this is the case even when individuals who have migrated to Russia gain Russian citizenship. So the racism and labor segmentation continues even past that point. We also see the literature being focused on the role of wage remittances. So their home economies are very reliant on the wage remittances being sent back, but it's also seen as a way to achieve moral or honest labor. So rather than not being able to work in their home state, they're able to find labor in Russia that is, in their opinion, more fulfilling than what they would be able to have in their home country in Central Asia. So on one part, this is economic rationality. There's a lack of jobs and a lack of opportunities for advancements within Central Asia, so they leave, but it's also part of the desire to provide for families and a way to define oneself via work that is not available in Central Asia. But despite this focus on moral labor, we still see a very high degree of patronal politics happening. So we still have patron-client networks active in migrant labor. So most people find their jobs through connections and networks of co-ethnics, where those who have lived longer in Russia act as brokers who aid new migrants. And many of these migrants are in very vulnerable positions, where they sometimes lack documentation or can be targeted by the police, and there's a lack of affordable housing for new migrants. And so these connections are necessary to find jobs and housing and to get access to basic necessities. And people who have migrated to Russia use loopholes in the system and the fact that, according to them, they all look the same to Russian security forces to acquire these goods and jobs for themselves. So a reading that looked at the Kyrgyz couple, they have Russian passports, and their Russian passports are actually passed around to their family members because of the racism that they experience, because Russians can't tell the difference between individual Kyrgyz individuals. They're able to use their Russian passports to get family members into Russia. But again, these individuals are still highly vulnerable and can be targeted by police. And their position is fragile. So once again, they spoke on getting Russian citizenship because it lowers the probability that they'll be deported or targeted by the police, even though they don't plan on living in Russia in the long term. So in this map, we're looking specifically at migration in Kazakhstan. So we can see that we saw net migration out of Kazakhstan until 2002. And it spiked in 1994. So we see the impact of the collapse in the Soviet Union triggering a population flight from Kazakhstan. But we do see arrivals and departures balancing out later on. So in the later 2000s, these numbers have become roughly equal. So we see roughly the same number of people leaving as arriving, although we can see from this graph that the net in migration is slightly higher. So there are more people coming in than exiting, although these in no way match the net migration out until 2002. So the numbers migrating out earlier on are much larger than the arrivals that we see now. In this graph, conversely, we see the reported remittances from Russia in millions of US dollars. So we can see that the country that sends back the greatest wage remittances is Uzbekistan. We see the least from Turkmenistan. They still have remittances, but it's negligible compared to the others. Kazakhstan also sees lower levels of wage remittances. Interestingly, though, there has been less population flight. We do see the degree of wage remittances going up between 2010 and 2011. This is perhaps due to the fact that the two have greater resource wealth than the other ones, so are more able to provide for their citizenry, and there's more opportunities for economic advancement. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have the highest amounts of wage remittances being sent back. They're also some of the most rural and the most dependent in rural areas on one major crop, being Uzbekistan, and also the most unstable, looking at Tajikistan. Kyrgyzstan is kind of in the middle, so they have some leftovers from the Soviet-era military-industrial complex, allowing for greater labor opportunities. They also have some extraction industry in their economy that is providing some means of labor. So they're really in between the two biggest sending back wage remittances being Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and the two least being Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. In addition to sending back wage remittances, we also see a variety of locations that migrant labor travels to. So on one hand, we see people going to major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg to take on roles engaging in manual or undesired labor. But here there are avenues for advancement and access to really complex networks of co-ethnics and acquaintances that can provide one with housing and access to jobs. And keep in mind that the Russian population itself is very highly concentrated in Moscow and St. Petersburg, so there is a lot of migration to those two cities in particular. But we also see travel to more remote locales that are more focused on resource extraction. So Russia has a lot of natural resources, but they're not predominantly located where the majority of the Russian population lives. So they aren't in the western portions of the country and the European portions of the country. They're instead located in the east. And even more so than in the east, they're located in the far north. So you have locales that are focused on resource extraction above or near the Arctic Circle. And these locales have very harsh climates, and they're spots where Russians do not want to work. And these locations have been a long-standing destination of migration. So they existed even during the Soviet era, and the type of work is very consistent. They have networks of their own wherein those who have been there the longest have primacy. So ethnic Tajiks have been in a lot of these locations longest in the post-Soviet era, as they moved there largely in 1992 when the Civil War broke out. And different groups are brought in for different reasons. So most from Central Asia are brought in as unskilled labor. So unskilled laborers travel to these locations in the far north. But Russian companies who engage in extraction also recruit pretty heavily from technical institutes in Kazakhstan for the qualified personnel on these sites. So once again, these are not major cities, but the work is consistent, if sometimes seasonal, and there are divisions between ethnic groups and between their networks. But the work is more stable there than it might be in a major city that's more dependent upon kind of these supply and demand job opening type of labor markets, whereas the extraction, as long as the site remains open, is there for migrants to work at. Also, the fact that there are fewer ethnic Russians at these sites in the far north means that the expression of racism is different. It's still there, but it is not quite as pervasive as it is in major cities. And a through line that we see with all migration and also with rural and urban life is the importance of networks. They're crucial for maintaining connections between individuals, both within Central Asia, so within a given locale, and between individuals who have traveled outside of their home to send wages back. So these networks are how individuals find jobs, they're how people maintain those jobs, they're how they aid others. and also how they relate back to their home. So first off, you have local networks and ties. So these are networks that you find in Russia, where there's a large number of migrants, and it's because individuals want to maintain their way of life, even if they've migrated, even if they live in Russia, they still want to keep their cultural practices, and these don't have to be kind of the more traditional practices that we've talked about in the past. It can just be speaking Kyrgyz or Tajik instead of Russian, or cooking dishes or sharing meals. And so they tend to seek out co-ethnics and build networks to have those connections and to find belonging and safety. So groups, once again, regardless of destination, are still very vulnerable, and these local communities offset that. So those who have been there longer provide aid to new arrivals and even help people get into the country. And most travel to locations where they have connections or acquaintances from family members who have traveled there before. So it's not uncommon that you will see a family member travel to a destination and then have their aid their family members in also arriving. We also see regional ties. So we see linked localities. So a community in Central Asia is hooked into a network in Russia. And this in part comes from both the imperial and Soviet eras, where you did see migration from Central Asia into Russia then. And there are certain patterns of migration. So once again, you go where you know people, or you know people who know people. You're following where you have acquaintances, because without those acquaintances, you are not likely to find basic necessities or work in Russia. We also see global networks starting to form. And these connections go beyond the clan, beyond ethnic group, beyond the state. So sometimes you see individuals who have left Central Asia identify as post-Soviet Muslims rather than as their ethnic group or from their clan. And this forges ties with other Muslim groups from regions outside of Central Asia in the former USSR. So these regions also see a lot of outmigration, so looking specifically at areas in the North Caucasus or Azerbaijan. These are also locales where we see a large number of post-Soviet Muslims migrating into the Russian interior, also looking for work. So there are wider networks that are more heterogeneous than those that are local or regional, but they are larger and have greater capacity and a greater potential for perhaps lobbying to secure greater rights for these migrant communities. So in this lecture, we have seen several common themes arise. The first being of rural hardships and urban opportunities. So there's a lack of funding to rural regions and a lack of economic opportunities and a corresponding expansion of urbanization, which has led to explosive city growth that has really stressed infrastructure, housing, and employment opportunities. So there is a mismatch between kind of this perception of opportunities in rural areas and the actual ability for urban and locales to provide for new migrants. There's still better opportunities in urban areas than in rural ones, leading to rural depopulation. But urban areas are not able to provide for these new migrants either. We also see persistent wealth inequalities. So elites are still the primary winners in this system. The presidents, their circles, and those with wealth are those that continue to be in a position of power. And it's not about creating greater equality or greater economic opportunities for those elite. So we're seeing these wealth inequalities continue. And without a lot of government programs specifically geared at alleviating those inequalities, they are likely to continue. Urban-rural divides also cause wealth inequality. So once again, there are few incentives to revise government programs or to shift wealth allocations. And those who would object to The lack of funding to rural environments oftentimes have either moved to cities or have migrated out of Central Asia in search of work. And the region is very dependent on migrant laborers and wage remittances. So these individuals often work below their qualifications and have left due to a lack of opportunities or payoffs or chances for advancements in their home countries. And wage remittances, debt repayments, and the like are only possible to secure when one is either permanently or seasonally living and working abroad. We also see the importance of networks. So both at home and abroad, these are how one finds employment and affordable housing. These networks are a location of trust and connections, and that trust and connection can often outweigh outright qualifications. And this is often viewed as how things are done, how they are accomplished both at home and in foreign states. So connections with elites secures goods and offers protection. Connections with co-ethnics or acquaintances abroad also offers protections and secures you goods and jobs. And while this is not done through political elite, it is done through acquaintances and informal networks. And those who have been in the locale, be this Moscow or the far north, in mining communities or in oil extraction towns, act as brokers for newcomers to Russia. And as we move forward, it'll be really important to keep these themes in mind when we start talking about foreign interests in Central Asia, when we talk about corruption or gender issues in Central Asia. These exist not only for the communities that are in Central Asia, but also can persist in the migrant communities abroad. So that is where we will leave off for this lecture. I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts on Tuesday.